The dust tasted of victory and disbelief. It rose in a golden plume behind them, kicked up by the frantic, failing hooves of Silas Blackwood's champion. Beneath Alara, the horse moved like a river, a fluid power that seemed to unspool from the very center of the earth. She felt it not in the saddle, but in her own bones, a rhythm she had taught herself over 2 years of patient listening. His name was Ghost, and he was supposed to be dead. Or, if not dead, then a cripple, a waste of hay, a monument to the foolishness of a young woman alone on a worthless plot of land. The shouts of the townspeople along the finish line were a roar of confusion, turning to awe. They were not cheering for her, not yet. They were cheering for the impossibility they were witnessing. 100 yards to go. Blackwood's big bay, a stallion that had cost $1,000, was faltering, its lungs screaming for air it could not find in the hot, dry afternoon. Ghost, the $3 colt with the twisted leg, pulled ahead. His gait was perfect, a long, low, ground-eating stride that was pure grace. Alara leaned forward, her hand resting on his neck, not pulling, not pushing, just being there. A silent promise kept. She could feel the 5 hearts Mr. Anselm had told her about. The 4 in his feet, steady and sure on the packed earth, and the great one in his chest, beating a wild and triumphant drum against her knee. The finish post, a simple wooden stake, loomed. The world narrowed to that single point. The roar of the crowd faded to a hum. There was only the wind, the horse, and the last few feet of a journey that had begun in shame. 2 years earlier, the dust had tasted only of defeat. It coated the back of Alara's throat at the annual stock auction on the edge of the town of Prosperity. It was a name that felt like a joke. She stood at the back of the crowd, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn dress, a single silver dollar cool against her palm. It was the last of her father's money, the rest having gone to bury him and settle the deed on the 40 acres of cracked clay and bitterweed he had called a farm. The auctioneer's voice was a practiced, rhythmic chant, selling off strings of sturdy geldings and promising young Mares to ranchers with money to spend. The undisputed king of the sale was Silas Blackwood. He stood near the front, his polished boots planted wide, bidding with a casual flick of his finger. He bought for the army, for the eastern markets, for his own sprawling ranch that drank the lion's share of the county's water. He was a man who understood value in terms of muscle and bone, and the crowd watched him, their own small hopes rising and falling with his pronouncements. Alara watched him too, but she was listening for something else. She was listening for the note of dismissal, the sound of something being passed over. She had learned from her father that true value was often quiet. It hid in the overlooked corners, in the things that everyone else was in a hurry to discard. He had taught her to read the land, to see the deep clover that grew where the soil was sweet, to know the way water ran underground long after the surface was parched. Now she was trying to apply that lesson to the world of men and commerce, a world that felt loud and brutally simple. A horse was either strong or it was meat. A piece of land was either fertile or it was a burden. The town had already passed its judgment on her and her inheritance. She was a young woman alone, too quiet, too stubborn, clinging to a patch of dirt that wouldn't even grow decent weeds. They watched her with a mixture of pity and impatience, waiting for her to fail. The day wore on. The best stock was sold, and the prices began to fall. The crowd thinned. Now came the culls, the old, the ill-tempered, the less than perfect. A stable hand led a young colt into the ring. He was a strange, watery blue roan, with a coat that seemed to shift from gray to silver in the flat afternoon light. But it wasn't his color that drew the low murmur of pity from the crowd. It was his walk. His left foreleg was twisted, the knees swollen and hot-looking, causing him to dip and stumble with every step. He held his head high, though, and his eyes, a dark, intelligent brown, scanned the faces of the crowd with a startling lack of fear. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this one?" the auctioneer asked, his voice losing its energetic cadence. "A yearling, good lines, if you can get past the gimp." "A shame, that is silence." A few men chuckled. Silas Blackwood, turning to leave, glanced back at the colt and snorted. "That's kill buyer bait," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not worth the lead to shoot him. The kill buyer, a grim man named Finch, didn't even bother to raise a hand. The colt was too small. The meat on him not worth the trouble of hauling. The stable hand gave the lead rope a tug, ready to lead the animal away to an uncertain fate. $1, a voice said. It was quiet, but clear. Every head turned. It was Alara. The auctioneer squinted, shielding his eyes. Did I hear a bid? $1, she repeated, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The silver dollar in her pocket suddenly felt heavy as a stone. A ripple of laughter went through the remaining crowd. Blackwood paused, a look of amused contempt on his face. The girl's buying horse meat, someone muttered. The auctioneer looked from Alara to Blackwood, then back. He sighed. $1 it is. Going once, going twice sold. To the young lady with more heart than sense, the gavel fell with a flat, final thud. Alara walked forward, her back straight, ignoring the stares. She handed over her dollar and took the lead rope. The colt turned his head and looked at her, his gaze unwavering. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of something that was not defeat. The walk home was a gauntlet of quiet mockery. She passed the mercantile, where men sitting on the porch stopped their conversation to watch her lead the limping colt down the dusty street. There goes Alara's last dollar, one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. Wasting it on that, she did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, feeling the colt's uneven steps through the rope in her hand. He did not pull or fight her. He simply walked, his trust a fragile, unearned gift. Her land was 2 miles out of town, a place the road seemed to go out of its way to avoid. It was 40 acres of shallow soil over a shelf of hardpan clay, but had one treasure, a small, bowl-like depression at the back, where a deep well her father had dug still held cool, clear water. The town saw only the cracked fields. She saw the hidden basin and the well. When they finally arrived, the sun was low, painting the scrubby landscape in forgiving shades of orange and purple. The colt lowered his head and drank deeply from the trough she filled, his thirst immense. As he drank, a figure appeared at the fence line. It was Mr. Anselm, her only neighbor. He was a German immigrant, an old man with hands gnarled from a lifetime of working with horses in a country he no longer called home. He had a small, neat farm with 2 stout draft horses and a patch of improbably green alfalfa. The town found him as odd as they found her. He leaned his arms on the top rail of the fence, his eyes, pale blue and sharp, fixed on the colt. Alara braced herself for another dose of pity. But Anselm was silent for a long time. He watched the way the colt stood, the way he favored the bad leg, the proud set of his head. "They laughed at you in town," he said at last. It was not a question. "Yes," Alara said. "Blackwood said he was meat." Anselm nodded slowly. He pushed himself off the fence and came through the gate, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked around the colt, then knelt, running his hand gently down the swollen leg. The colt flinched but did not pull away. Anselm's touch was impossibly gentle. "He is not meat," the old man said, looking up at her. "A horse has 5 hearts, 4 in his feet and 1 in his chest. You must listen to all 5. This one here," he tapped the colt's chest, "this one is very strong. But the hearts in his feet are hurting." He straightened up with a soft grunt. "There is heat. We must draw it out. Clay from the creek bed, mixed with comfrey and plantain. Every day, twice a day." For a long time, he looked at her, his expression serious. "It is slow work. It will cost you time you do not have." "I have nothing but time," Alara said. A small smile touched the corner of Mr. Anselm's mouth. "Good," he said. "Then you have everything you need." The work began. It was a ritual that governed her days and bookend her nights. Before the sun rose, she would walk to the creek that bordered Anselm's property, her bucket in hand. She dug the cool, gray clay from the bank, then gathered the broad, fuzzy leaves of comfrey and the ribbed leaves of plantain that grew in the damp places. In her kitchen, she mashed the herbs into a dark green pulp and mixed them with the clay to make a thick, fragrant poultice. The colt, who had at first been skittish, soon learned the routine. He would stand quietly as she slathered the cool mixture over his swollen knee, her hands gentle and sure. She would wrap it in clean cloths, then lead him for a short, slow walk around the yard. Then she would do it all again at dusk. The rest of her day was spent on the arithmetic of survival. She had a small garden, a handful of chickens, and a deep well. She counted her eggs, measured her flour, calculated how long the meager supply of oats she'd bought for the chickens could be stretched to feed the colt. Her life became a study in conservation, in making a little go a long way. Hunger was a quiet, constant companion, a dull ache she learned to ignore. Meanwhile, the town watched and waited for her to give up. Riders would sometimes go out of their way to pass her property, slowing to stare at the girl in the yard with her hands covered in mud, tending to the crippled horse. The verdict was always the same. She was a fool, throwing good effort after bad. One afternoon, a boy appeared at her fence. He was small for his age, with a shock of red hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose. It was Finn, the blacksmith's youngest son, a boy as overlooked in his own boisterous family as her land was in the county. He didn't say anything, just watched her wrap the colt's leg. The next day, he was back. On the third day, he spoke. "Does it help?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I think so," Alaris said. "It feels cooler." Finn climbed the fence and came closer. He held out a hand to the colt, who sniffed it, then nudged him gently. "He looks like a ghost in the morning light," Finn said. Alara looked at the colt's pale, silvery coat. "Ghost," she said, trying the name out. It fit. From that day on, Finn was a regular presence. He would show up after his chores at the smithy were done, his pockets often hiding a pilfered apple or a lump of sugar. He helped Alara gather herbs, his small, quick hands better at plucking the leaves than hers. He talked to Ghost in a low, constant murmur, telling the horse all the things he never said to anyone else. And under their combined care, a change began. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first. The swelling in the knee began to recede, the fierce heat lessening until it was merely warm. Ghost started putting more weight on the leg, his limp becoming less pronounced. He was growing, his frame filling out, his coat gaining a deep, healthy sheen. The patient work was paying off. By the time the first anniversary of the auction came and went, Ghost was no longer a colt. He was a young horse, tall and lean, his awkward angles smoothing into elegant lines of muscle. The twisted leg was straight, the knee now only slightly thicker than the other, a faint scar in the hair the only sign of his old injury. The limp was gone, replaced by a barely perceptible hitch in his walk that vanished entirely when he moved any faster than a trot. Alara kept his progress a secret, like a coal banked low under ash. To the casual observer passing on the road, he was just a horse in a field. But Alara and Finn and Mr. Anselm knew better. They saw the truth in the hidden basin behind the house. One evening, as Finn was leaving, a jackrabbit burst from a clump of sagebrush and shot across the pasture. Before Alara could even call out, Ghost exploded into motion. It was not a run, it was a form of flight. He didn't seem to push off the ground, but to flow over it, his body long and low, his legs a blur. He covered 100 yards in a handful of seconds, turning on a dime as the rabbit dodged, his movements impossibly fluid. He didn't catch the rabbit, but he didn't seem to be trying. He was just running for the sheer joy of it. He trotted back to them, his head high, his nostrils flared, and nudged Alara's shoulder as if to ask if she had seen. She had. She stood frozen, her heart pounding with a fierce, protective joy. It had worked. All the poultices, the slow walks, the careful feeding, the endless arithmetic of hope against despair, it had all worked. Finn was beaming, his face lit with a proprietary pride. "I told you," he whispered. "I told you he was fast." Mr. Anselm, who had been watching from his side of the fence, simply nodded, a deep satisfaction in his eyes. "The heart in his chest was always strong," he said. "Now the hearts in his feet have caught up from then on." The basin became their secret training ground. Alara, using a saddle her father had left hanging in the barn, began to ride him. The first time she asked for a gallop, the world dissolved into a rush of wind and blurred earth. The power beneath her was terrifying and exhilarating. He ran with an eagerness that felt like a gift, his stride so smooth it was like rocking in a cradle. She learned to trust him, to move with him, to become part of his effortless motion. The town, however, was slow to change its mind. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Silas Blackwood rode by one day, reining in his big quarter horse to stare over the fence. Ghost was standing by the trough, sleek and powerful, a picture of health. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. The worthless colt he had dismissed was gone, replaced by a horse that made his own expensive stock look common. "That's the gimp you bought," he said, his tone a mix of disbelief and condescension. "Cleaned up better than I'd have thought. His name is Ghost," Ilaris said quietly. Blackwood grunted. "I'll give you $50 for him." More than fair for a horse with a bad leg in his history. The offer was an insult, a way of reasserting the old order, of putting her and her horse back in their place. "He's not for sale," Ilara replied, her voice calm. Blackwood's face tightened. "Don't be a fool, girl. A horse is only worth what someone will pay. That's the best offer you'll ever get for him." He spurred his horse and rode off, but Ilara saw him look back twice, his expression no longer amused. It was the look of a man who had overlooked something valuable and now coveted it. The second year passed. Ghost matured into his full strength, a magnificent animal who drew the eye of anyone who saw him. The hitch in his walk was a memory, a story whispered between Ilara and Finn. To the rest of the world, he was simply a stunning blue roan with a presence that was impossible to deny. Ilara took to riding him for her errands, the 2-mile trip to town now taking a matter of minutes. People would stop and stare as she trotted down the main street, the horse moving with a proud, easy grace. The whispers that followed her now were not of pity, but of wonder and a grudging respect. She had done it. The girl they had all written off had turned nothing into something. But respect did not pay for oats, and while she was no longer starving, she was still poor. Her vindication was private, a quiet warmth she shared only with Finn and Mr. Anselm. Then the sky turned to brass. The spring rains never came. May bled into a hot, dry June, and June into a blistering July. The sun baked the land until the clay of Ilara's fields cracked into a mosaic of fissures. The creeks slowed to a trickle and then vanished, leaving behind winding beds of dry, sun-bleached stones. Prosperity was withering. The grass in the vast pastures of the big ranches turned brown, then gray, then to dust. The herds of cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards. The fine horses that had been the pride of the county stood listlessly in the heat, their heads hanging low. Silas Blackwood was hit hardest of all. His wealth was built on grass and water, and he had none of either. He had overstocked his land, confident in the endless bounty of the prairie, and now that bounty had been withdrawn. He spent a fortune hauling water and buying hay from out of state, but it was like trying to fill the ocean with a bucket. His empire was shrinking, his horses growing gaunt. Ilara's small farm, however, endured. Her 40 acres of worthless land had never supported a large herd, so she had not overgrazed it. Her deep, hand-dug well, the one her father had sunk into the hidden basin, continued to provide a steady, if diminished, supply of cool, clear water. It was enough for her garden, her chickens, and for one horse. Ghost remained sleek and strong, while the $1,000 champions in other pastures faded. The town's perception began to invert completely. Ilara's stubborn refusal to expand, once seen as a lack of ambition, now looked like wisdom. Her focus on a single, once broken animal, once seen as foolish sentiment, now looked like prudent conservation. She had survived not in spite of her limitations, but because of them. She had listened to the quiet economy of her own small world, and it had sustained her. The drought taught the people of prosperity a lesson they had long forgotten. The land, not money, had the final say. And the land was saying that big was not always strong, and that value was not always visible. The drought tightened its grip. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The dust from the fields was a constant haze in the air, coating everything with a fine red powder. People's tempers grew as short as their water supplies. Then, word came from the north. A small settlement at Miller's Creek, 50 miles away, had been struck by scarlet fever. The news arrived via a rider on a half-dead horse, a boy who had collapsed at the doctor's door. They had no medicine, and children were dying. Prosperity's doctor, a grim, tired man named Hayes, had the serum, but getting it there was the problem. 50 miles of dry, rugged country under a killing sun. It was a ride that would destroy any normal horse. The town council convened an emergency meeting on the steps of the Mercantile. Silas Blackwood was there, his face haggard, his usual arrogance replaced by a brittle defensiveness. The mayor, a hardware merchant named Peterson, laid out the situation. "We need a rider, and we need a horse that can make the distance." Fast, a silence fell over the assembled men. They all knew the state of the county's livestock. "My bay," one rancher started, then shook his head. He couldn't make 10 miles, another agreed. "My string is all but done for." All eyes eventually turned to Blackwood. He was the biggest rancher. His champion stallion was famous throughout the territory. Blackwood shifted his weight, his face flushing. "The stallion, the heat has been hard on him," he admitted, the words costing him dearly. "He's not fit for it." The silence that followed was heavy with the town's collective fear. Their pride, their wealth in horseflesh, was useless. They had 100 strong-looking horses, and not one of them could answer the call. It was Finn who spoke, his voice high and clear from the edge of the crowd where he'd been listening. "Alara's horse could do it," he said. "Ghost could do it." Every head turned to him. Then they turned to look down the street toward Alara's property, as if they could see the horse from there. The idea hung in the air, absurd and yet possible. The strange, solitary girl and her once lame horse. Blackwood let out a harsh laugh, a sound with no humor in it. "That cast-off? You'd trust the lives of those children to a $3 gimp." But no one was laughing with him. They were desperate, and desperation makes people consider the impossible. The mayor looked at Blackwood, then at the worried faces around him. "It's the only chance we have," he said. He turned to the sheriff. "Go get her." Alara arrived a few minutes later, walking with her usual quiet dignity, the sheriff at her side. She stood before the council, her gaze steady, as the mayor explained the situation. She listened without speaking, her expression unreadable. She knew what this was. It was the culmination of everything, the moment when all the private work and quiet faith would be tested in public. She could feel the weight of their expectations, a heavy cloak in the oppressive heat. They had laughed at her, pitted her, and dismissed her. Now they needed her. They needed the very thing they had scorned. It was a moment of absolute power, and she knew it. The mayor cleared his throat. "Miss Alara," he said, his tone respectful for the first time she could ever remember hearing. "We need your horse. The town will pay. Name your price. $100? 200. The sum was staggering, more money than she had ever seen. It would mean a new barn, feed for a decade's security. It would be her final, irrefutable victory. She could gouge them, and they would have to pay. She saw the greed in one man's eyes, the calculation in another's. And she saw the genuine fear in the face of the blacksmith, Finn's father, who had a cousin in Miller's Creek. Then she looked at Silas Blackwood. His face was a mask of resentment. He could not bear to be saved by her, by the horse he had declared worthless. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood snapped. "We have no proof that horse is anything but a pasture ornament. I'll make a real wager. My champion against her fluke. We'll race to the old cottonwood and back. If her horse wins, I'll pay the 200 myself. If my horse wins, I take the contract. A fair test." It was not a fair test. His horse was exhausted and gaunt. It was a desperate, prideful bluff, a way for him to seize control of the narrative. But it gave Alara an opening. She looked past the mayor, past Blackwood, and met the blacksmith's worried gaze. She thought of the sick children, of the doctor's serum sitting useless on a shelf. This was not about money or pride. It never had been. "The ride is not for sale," she said, her voice cutting through the murmuring. A shocked silence fell. She turned to Blackwood. "But I will race you," she continued, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. to the cottonwood and back. If your horse wins, you can have the glory. But if Ghost wins, she paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You will pay for the doctor's entire supply wagon. Not just the serum. Everything. And you will pay for the feed and water to get his team there and back. The terms were audacious. Generous to the town, but a direct, public challenge to Blackwood's pride and his wallet. It was a bet he could not refuse without looking like a coward and a miser. His face went pale, then red. Done, he spat. The race was on. It began where it would end, on the main street, which had been hastily cleared. The entire town lined the route. Blackwood was astride his famous bay stallion. The horse was a shadow of its former self, its coat dull, its eyes anxious, but it still had the powerful frame of a champion. At the starting line, Elara swung into her saddle. Ghost stood calm and ready, his energy a contained force. Mr. Anselm gave her leg a final pat. Listen to his hearts, he whispered. The mayor fired a pistol into the air, and they were off. The bay, relying on muscle memory, lunged forward, taking an early lead. Blackwood, a skilled and ruthless rider, pushed him hard from the start, trying to win the race in the first quarter mile. The crowd roared, a wave of sound that followed them out of town. Elara held Ghost back, letting him find his rhythm. She could feel his power coiled beneath her, a spring wound tight. He wanted to run, but he waited for her signal. They thundered down the dusty road, the bay's hooves throwing dirt in their faces. Blackwood was leaning low, his expression a grimace of effort. He was riding for his pride, for the restoration of his world. Elara was riding for something else entirely. She was riding for the patient truth she had nurtured in secret. As they neared the halfway point, the giant skeletal cottonwood that marked the turn, the bay began to labor. The initial burst of speed, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will, was fading. The drought had taken too much from him. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps. Elara felt Ghost's own breathing, deep and even. He was not tired. He was just beginning. As they rounded the tree, Elara gave him a slight nudge with her knees. It was all the signal he needed. He lengthened his stride, and the coiled spring released. The feeling was one of effortless acceleration. They did not seem to be moving faster, so much as the world seemed to be slowing down around them. They drew level with Blackwood's flagging champion. For a moment, they were side by side, a tableau of past and present. The $1,000 horse, the symbol of a brittle and arrogant power, now spent and gasping. And the $3 cull, the emblem of quiet patience, now sleek and brimming with a deep, well-tended strength. Blackwood glanced over, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He raised his whip to strike his failing horse, but he was too late. Ghost pulled ahead. The race was no longer a contest. It became a procession. Ghost flowed over the packed earth, his hooves seeming to barely touch the ground. Elara leaned into the rhythm, a part of the horse, a part of the wind. The shouts of the townspeople changed as they came back into view. The initial roar for Blackwood's horse had been a cheer for the familiar, for the way things were supposed to be. The new sound was different. It was a cry of pure astonishment. They were seeing the impossible made real. They were seeing a truth they had refused to believe, and it was glorious. The dust rose behind them, a golden plume of victory. She crossed the finish line, not by a nose, but by a dozen lengths, with Ghost still pulling, still ready to run. She slowed him to a canter, then a trot, and brought him to a stop before the stunned faces of the town council. It was over. A profound silence settled over the main street, broken only by the sound of Ghost's steady breathing and the distant, heaving gasps of Blackwood's defeated stallion. Silas Blackwood dismounted, his face ashen. He did not look at Elara. He looked at his horse, then at the ground, a man undone by a truth he had refused to see. He had been beaten not by a rival, but by his own short-sightedness, his own arrogance, shamed in front of the entire community. Without a word, he turned, walked to the mayor, and handed him a thick fold of cash. Then he led his broken horse away, vanishing into the dust and the shame. The crowd surged forward, but they kept a respectful distance. They looked at Elara and at Ghost with a new kind of awe. The blacksmith, Finn's father, was the first to approach. His face was streaked with dust and tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "You've given them a chance." Dr. Hayes was already loading his wagon, his movements urgent. Alara slid from the saddle, her legs trembling slightly. Finn ran to her side, his face shining, and threw his arms around Ghost's neck. The horse lowered his head and nudged the boy gently. The ride to Miller's Creek was made, the serum was delivered, and the children were saved. The story of the race, and of the lame colt that became the fastest horse in the county, became a local legend, a story told to children to teach them about patience and hidden worth. The drought broke a week later. A slow, steady rain fell for 3 days, washing the dust from the air and soaking into the grateful earth. The land began to heal. Alara's victory was quiet but absolute. She was no longer the foolish girl on the worthless land. She was the woman who had saved them, the one who had seen what no one else could. She was offered money, land, her pick of the county's recovering stock. She refused it all. She had what she needed. She had her 40 acres, her deep well, her friend Finn, her mentor Mr. Anselm, and she had Ghost. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the newly greening pasture, the three of them stood with the horse. Ghost grazed peacefully, his coat gleaming like polished silver in the twilight. Finn sat on the top rail of the fence, content just to be near. Mr. Anselm stood beside Alara, watching the horse. "You listened," the old man said softly. To all 5 hearts, Alara looked at the magnificent animal, the embodiment of her faith and her stubborn work. She thought of the auction, the laughter, the long months of doubt, and the quiet arithmetic of hope. She had not set out to be a hero or to shame a rich man. She had only set out to save one small, broken life. In the end, it had been enough to save them all. Being right was its own kind of reply, but being kind was its own kind of victory. The land was green, the well was full, and the horse was home.